Global TV send another one. Oh, 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 oh. Global TV, I send them home. Yeah, man, this is Michael Buckley. I tell you, say, yo, the Global TV, yeah, man, me represent that 100%. Play the music, Global. Boom, shot.
The crime, the cover-up, the twisted investigation. Good evening, a pleasant good evening from the United Kingdom, and good morning to those in the Caribbean and North America. A pleasant Sunday afternoon and pleasant Sunday morning to you all. Thank you for joining us. You can see on the thumbnail why we're here. I'm sorry for the late arrival. This is due to circumstances beyond my control, but a lot is going on in relation to the death of Melissa Silvera. And we have to ask a lot of questions. There is a lot of open questions from what has happened. And we cannot let anything slip or go unchecked. We have to ask a lot of questions. I want to start this morning with Peter Champagne, the attorney retained by Julian Silvera. Mr. Champagne is saying that he is not a suspect at the moment, and people should refrain from blah, blah, blah. But I want to say to Mr. Champagne, if you can provide us with any information, or Mr. Silvera can provide us with information that there was a break-in and entry at his house. Other than that, we will be speculating as we damn well want to. Until you, Mr. Champagne or Mr. Silvera, can provide us with the information that there was a break-in and entry at Mr. Silvera's house, based on the autopsy report that his wife was unalived by at least 3 gunshot wounds. So until Peter Champagne or Mr. Silvera can provide us with that information, that there was a break-in and entry at the Silvera's house, we are going to speculate and we are going to ask whatever damn well question we want to. Don't come to sidetrack us and shut us up because you're paid to. This is not going to work around here, because we're dealing with crime and cover-up by politicians. Before I take these people to task bit by bit, I want to say to Mr. Golden, come out and make another statement. Because Mr. Silvera has seemed to dupe you into deploying sympathy, knowing that he has unalived his wife, and I'm using the word unalive just here for algorithm. Not that I'm afraid of defamation on this matter. How well did Mr. Silvera cover up this crime? How well did Mr. Silvera cover up this crime? That the first responders did not realize that they walked into an open crime scene. How well did Mr. Silvera cover up the crime? Who pronounced Mrs. Silvera dead. This is the very most first and important person that start to protect Mr. Silvera and assisting Mr. Silvera with the cover-up. Normally what happens, we know there is two Jamaica. Normally what happens, when a person died at home, unexplained, the police gets involved. We know that there's a downtown Jamaica and an uptown Jamaica, but the police normally gets involved. It's the process when an unexplained death, a young woman of 40 years old, apparently have no underlying medical illness. And the argument purported by Mr. Silvera and those who went to the house the morning in the news media that she died in her sleep, we would draw the inference that Mrs. Silvera died peacefully. She died in her sleep. We would draw the inference that Mrs. Silvera died peacefully. Who pronounced Mrs. Silvera dead? Was it the police or a doctor? Who authorized the removal of Mrs. Silvera's body from the house? Which funeral director or hospital removed Mrs. Silvera's body from the house? Where was Mrs. Silvera's body moved to from the house? Because based on what we're hearing from the autopsy report, Mrs. Silvera died from at least 3 gunshot wounds. At least 3. When a person dies and an undertaker goes, say, at home, and the undertaker goes to the house to remove the body after the pronouncement of death, whether it be by a doctor or a police, which the practice in our state, there is a ritual that is performed by the funeral direction in the decent and timely manner in how you handle that body, in wrapping up the body and all of that before the removal. What did you recognize? Did you spot anything unusual? Let's roll back. If she died from 3 gunshot wounds or more, at what point would she have been shot and killed? That we would assume that when the police or the doctor get to the house, pronounce her dead, they didn't spot anything off. There was no odd type of bleeding or any form of odd type of injury on the body. The first person who got there, whether it's the police or a doctor, to pronounce Mrs. Silvera dead, started the cover-up, started to protect Mr. Silvera in a cover-up, whether it's a police or a doctor. A rich uptown people, them can call them private doctor if they wish. If Mrs. Silvera was pronounced dead by a doctor, who was it? What type of physical assessment was done by who pronounced Mrs. Silvera dead? Did they just check that she wasn't breathing or check her pulse, or what was the method used by the professional, whether it be the police or the doctor, who pronounced Mrs. Silvera dead? Because that person is the first person that started to protect Mr. Silvera in this cover-up. So the police or the doctor must come under huge scrutiny. The method by which they pronounce her dead must come under scrutiny. The funeral directors are involved in a cover-up and must come under scrutiny. Was the police, if it was a police who pronounced her dead, or if it was a doctor, were they paid to cover up what they saw when they attend the crime scene? In the description, there is a link from Nationwide News, because the information that I'm going on is what Nationwide report, because I don't want to play their thing over here. I've put the link in the description where you can go and listen to what Nationwide said. Mr. Silvera, from the 10th, 11th of November until Friday, have us believe that his wife died in her sleep. Mr. Silvera, from the 10th to the 11th of November until Friday, have us believe, whipped up in everybody's sympathy, that his wife died in her sleep. Now we know it turned out to be different. Who is the doctor or the police that attended the Silvera's house on the morning of the 11th of November? Did they notice anything off or odd? And if they did, were they paid to keep silence? If they did not, will there be question raised of their professional ethics and the way in which they carried out their work? Or was it because this is a politician, so they work on the order of the politician? What if this was downtown? If Mr. Silvera was from downtown or rural Jamaica, would Mr. Silvera not be arrested already? If Mrs. Silvera was murdered and there's no break-in and entry at the Silvera's residence, who else other than Mr. Silvera could have shot and killed his wife? Who else other than Mr. Silvera who could have carried out the crime if there's no break-in and entry at the Silvera's residence? Who else could have carried out the crime if not Mr. Silvera? When was the last time and whom spoke to Mrs. Silvera before the 11th of November? Who saw last, and outside of the household, who would have been the last person to see Mrs. Silvera or speak to Mrs. Silvera outside of her husband and children? But the police or doctor and the funeral director must come under huge scrutiny. Why is Mr. Silvera not arrested? Champagne say he's not a suspect. To Fitzbailey, why, when you came out and tell the nation that the incident at the Silvera's house is now a homicide investigation? Why is Mr. Silvera not arrested on suspicion of murder for questioning? If Mr. Silvera was from downtown or rural Jamaica, would Mr. Silvera still be at freedom to possibly go on the run or unalive other people? Why is Mr. Silvera not arrested? Is it because Mr. Silvera is from uptown? Is it because Mr. Silvera is a politician? Why is Mr. Silvera not arrested? Is the undertaker on the investigation? Is the professional who pronounced Mrs. Silvera dead under investigation? Because there's a lot of person to call into question here. And to Fitz Bailey, is the Silvera residence closed off as an active crime scene? Nationwide report spoke about this, the bedroom of the Silveras since the 11th of November to now has gone through significant renovation. Was Mr. Silvera given the opportunity to clean up the evidence? So the first set of investigators who went to Silvera's residence, was Mr. Silvera given the opportunity to cover up the evidence of the crime? Who are the police who is involved in the cover-up? If there's a doctor involved in the cover-up, who is the doctor that is assisting that has assisted Mr. Silvera until the autopsy report become public to cover the crime? Who are those people? Whether it be a police who pronounce her dead, or a doctor, or the undertaker who removed her from the house. Who are those people who have assisted Mr. Silvera in covering up a crime? Even though Mr. Silvera has not been arrested, has not, and is not been convicted, I am going to say, until Mr. Silvera can prove otherwise, Mr. Silvera is a criminal. I will retract that only if Mr. Silvera can show that there was a break-in and entry at his house. And why on the 11th of November, Mr. Silvera did not report that there was a break-in and entry at his house. And furnish us with the evidence of how surprised you became on Friday that your wife was murdered. Because you have all of us believe, Mr. Silvera, that your wife's been murdered, that your wife died in her sleep. We assume peacefully. Did Mrs. Silvera really die in her sleep? Did you shot her in a heated argument, or did you really shot her in her sleep? I'm not going to look for the motive, Mr. Silvera, as to why you've unalived your wife. This is for the investigators. What I want to ask, in 2007, when your 2-year-old drowned in the pool, under you, Mr. Silvera's supervision, did the child really die or was that a successful cover-up? Now that we've seen that you've unalived your wife on your first attempt was to cover it up and to get everybody else who comes around and have anything to deal with the issue to protect you in the cover-up, because you have now even drawn the leader of the opposition into questioning by what he may have known before Friday, because we know how eavesdropping go around the place. Have the children been spoken to? Did the children say anything? Was there any commotion at the Silvera's residence on the night of the 10th of November? Did anyone within the vicinity of the Silvera residence heard any gunshot on the night of the 10th of November? If not, did Mr. Silvera use a silencer and whatever weapon he used? So Mr. Dull Dunce back of the class, backward champagne. Don't tell we what you think say our act. We know your dunce. Keep your dunceness, Peter Champagne, to yourself. During 2017, when the 2-year-old under Mr. Silvera supervision drowned in their swimming pool, if the child really drowned while being under the supervision of Mr. Silvera, the father, was Mr. Silvera under the influence of drugs or alcohol? Supervising a 2-year-old with a swimming pool in your backyard, the child went out of sight and managed to drown without you realizing for a time that the child was out of your presence. Was Mr. Silvera under the influence of drugs or alcohol while supervising a 2-year-old? Because under Jamaica law, there is a statute of child endangerment. If Mr. Silvera is supervising a 2-year-old child, and the child managed to get out of Mr. Silvera's presence and drowned, was Mr. Silvera investigated under the Child Endangerment Act? Mr. Silvera was supervising a 2-year-old. Was Mr. Silvera investigated under the Child Endangerment Act? Or was this another successful cover-up? Did the child really die? Or was this another successful cover-up? We see the attempt of this one. I would, in my knowledge, think that the doctor who performed the autopsy may have been approached to continue the string of cover-up, but decided not to. This is why this information is coming out from Friday, and since Friday. Because before the autopsy, I'm sure other people would have known that Mrs. Silvera did not die peacefully. The funeral directors would have known that Mr. Silvera did not die peacefully. Who removed Mr. Silvera's body from the crime scene? Who was the police, if there was a police, attended the Silvera's residence on the 11th of November? What was the state of the crime scene when they attended? Did they notice anything odd or off? What method was performed to pronounce Miss Silvera dead? This is corruption to the highest score. Politicians and police are involved in the cover-up of a crime. Police and politicians are involved in the cover-up of a crime. Was Mr. Silvera investigated under the Child Endangerment Act in 2017? Mr. Silvera was supervising a 2-year-old. The child was put in danger to the point where the child was drowned. Was Mr. Silvera investigated under the Child Endangerment Act? Is Mr. Silvera a serial murderer? We listened to Andre Stevens and Dr. Nesbitt, and we heard how much these politicians invest their time in voodoo to attain power. Did Mr. Silvera sacrifice his 2-year-old? Who was the police who gave Mr. Silvera the time to cover up and clean up the evidence, renovate the bedroom? Who are the police who would have missed the evidence on the open crime scene? If it is a doctor, who is the doctor that missed the evidence and the open crime scene? Because we all know when there's an unexplained death. Let me ask Mr. Silvera, were you on drugs before you thought about or commit this crime? Because if we're not fool, we know once there's an unexplained death, there ought to be an inquest, including a post-mortem, to establish the cause of death. Or is it because the first string of cover-up was so successful that Mr. Silvera thought he was going to continue cover the crime all the way? Because before the post-mortem, somebody who handled Miss Silvera's body would have realized that Miss Silvera didn't die peacefully in her sleep. How well did Mr. Silvera cover the first leg of the crime? Was the children in the house on the night of the 10th of November? Was the Silvera's children at the house on the night of the 10th of November? Mark Golden need to come out and make a speech. Mark Golden need to come out and make a speech denouncing the actions that ended the life of Mrs. Silvera. Mark Golden was one of the very first to come out and give his condolences. Yes, condolences to Mrs. Silvera's family and her children. But Mark Golden must come out and denounce the actions that ended the life of Mrs. Silvera. Mr. Golden must also come out and totally denounce and distance himself from Jolan Silvera. This is a crime that Mr. Silvera has drawn other people in, probably has paid them to help him to cover up. That should not give them any leeway, because what has happened here is a huge cover-up. What has happened here is a huge cover-up by politicians and police. And almost certain police went to the house on the morning of the 11th. When a person died, unless uptown is different from downtown and the rest of Jamaica. But when a person died at home unexplained, it's normally a police, and Jamaicans correct me if I'm wrong, it's normally a police that comes to the house and pronounce you dead and give authorization for before a funeral director can move the body. If it is a doctor, or if Mr. Silvera brought his private doctor to the house to pronounce Mrs. Silvera dead, who was that doctor? That doctor need to answer a lot of questions to the police. To Fitzbailey, who are you investigating at this point? Champagne is saying Jolan Silvera is not a suspect. Nowhere has anyone said to us since Friday, because it was not said before Friday, that there was a break-in and entry at the Silvera's residence. If there's no such information, then Mrs. Silvera could have only been shot by someone in the house. Was it one of the children who shot Mrs. Silvera? If Mr. Silvera is not a suspect, and Mr. Silvera is not arrested, wasn't Mrs. Silvera shot by any of her children? Was the children at the house on the night of the 11th, were the children at the house on the night of the 10th of November? If they were not there, then we could only assume, draw conclusion, draw inference based on the fact that there isn't any information about any break-in and entry, that Mr. Silvera could have and would have been the person who would have taken the life of his wife. Who is under investigation here, Mr. Fitzbailey? You say there's an open homicide investigation. Is the residence under the control of the police for the purpose of investigation? We have a process of a timeline of 6 weeks now. It is said in Nationwide report that Mr. Silvera, the bedroom of the Silveras, has gone through significant renovation. Significant renovation. This would have meant that a lot of evidence, if not all the evidence, would have been destroyed. The police who attended the Silvera's residence on the 11th of November would have given Mr. Silvera enough time to destroy the evidence. Have we not seen a murder like this before? Of course, the lawyer, the attorney of Andrew Holness, the Prime Minister of Jamaica, Patrick Bailey, 20 had stabbed and a gunshot. No break-in and entry. To date, Patrick Bailey has not been arrested, nor a proper subject of an investigation, but a murder was committed in Patrick Bailey's house. Do you think we're going to let this one go? Does Fitzbailey, the Commissioner of Police, and the government, and the political criminals, do you all think we're going to let this one go? Mrs. Silvera was murdered in her room or in her house. Do you think we're going to let this one go? The crime was committed by a politician. The police is assisting the politician to cover up the crime. Do you think we're going to let this one go? Mr. Golden, the faster you distance yourself from Mr. Silvera, the faster you distance yourself, Mr. Golden, from Mr. Silvera, will serve you better in the long run. Is the Silvera's residence closed off for forensic analysis? Are the children been questioned as witnesses if they were at the house on the night of the 10th of November? I'm not going to ask who murdered Mrs. Silvera. If there's no break-in and entry, Mrs. Silvera could only be killed by her children or her husband. Who of the residents of the Silvera's residence pulled the trigger? I don't want to know why. I only want to know who within the Silvera's residence pulled the trigger. Is it Mr. Silvera? Or is it one of the Silvera's children? There's no break-in and entry, no such report. It's too late to stage that now. Why is Mr. Silvera not arrested? Because I'm sure if Mr. Silvera was from Tivoli Gardens, door kick-off, house turned upside down, and he's battered bruised by police and all that, if Mr. Silvera was from downtown or rural Jamaica. I'm sure Mr. Silvera would have been arrested by now. Why is Mr. Silvera treated different from any other criminal or any other homicide situation where all the evidence is pointing to a member of the Silvera residence would have been the one who pulled the trigger. Does Mr. Silvera has a licensed firearm? And if so, is Mr. Bailey, has Mr. Bailey seized the licensed firearm of Mr. Silvera? Has the bullets gone off for forensic examination? Jamaica, keep your eyes on this. Don't let this cover up slide. Do not let this cover up slide. This is another Donnelly situation. Do not let the cover up slide. Do not let this cover up slide. These are the people. This is why I know we're mad as a race of people, as a set of people. I know we're mad. Because these are the very people we're asking to fix crime in Jamaica. Tell me if we're not mad. No, answer the question. Tell me if we're not mad. If we ask police and politicians to deal with the issue of crime in Jamaica, when this very crime where Mr. Silvera murdered his wife, Mr. Silvera is assisted by the first respondent who police would have been one in the cover-up of the crime. Tell me if we're not mad. They expect these two set of people to fix crime in Jamaica. Do not let Fitzbailey sidetrack us on this one. Remember, Fitzbailey came out and tell us Reverend Moore drove across the precipice as XY speed. And as the autopsy turned out with a broken disc, Mr. Moore came out of the car. Wasn't too happy that that didn't do the job well. Mr. Moore then proceeded to possibly the trunk of his car or the back seat, get a hanger, which isn't even a hanger, but that's the information they gave you. You know, like the green twisted fence, I'm not talking about chicken fence, the thicker one, is one of those type of wire. It wasn't a hanger. Them tell we say a hanger, but it wasn't a hanger. Trust me. Because we know that that's not true. But Mr. Moore was so upset that going over the precipice didn't do the job. Mr. Moore, with a broken disc, which based on what Reverend Bailey told us at the funeral, he wouldn't have been able to walk. He proceeded to hang himself. Fitzbailey told us that. If it wasn't Reverend Moore and Reverend Bailey at Reverend Moore's funeral, we wouldn't know that while Fitzbailey was giving us that information, Fitzbailey was privy to the postmortem and the information from the postmortem that Reverend Bailey gave to us at Reverend Moore's funeral. So we know Fitzbailey is a person who've involved in cover-up of crime. Don't let him sidetrack us on this one. It's one of their friends they're investigating. Remember the Noel situation. Noel was saying he's going to see the DSP later, which was Bailey, who was investigating Noel, and he will have words with him to find out where they took the truck to. So we know Fitzbailey is one of the corrupt police that likes to cover up crime as well. So don't let Fitzbailey get away with this one. They have given Mr. Silvera enough time to destroy the evidence of the crime scene. But Mr. Silvera, you're going to have to sue me. Is Mr. Silvera a serial murderer? Did Mr. Silvera, 2-year-old, drown? Or was that a successful cover-up? And if Mr. Silvera, 2-year-old, did drown, why was Mr. Silvera not investigated under the Child Endangerment Act? He put a child in danger. Was Mr. Silvera under the influence of drugs or alcohol during the 2017 incident when he was supervising his son that drowned? If it was downtown Jamaica or rural Jamaica, would the parents of the 2-year-old Silvera would they have been investigated under the Child Endangerment Act then? Why was Mr. Silvera not investigated under the Child Endangerment Act? Is it because Mr. Silvera is a politician? Why Mr. Silvera is not arrested? Nowhere else in the world this would have never happened. Anywhere else in the world this happened, Mr. Silvera would be in police custody from the 11th of November. The autopsy report became public knowledge 2 days ago. And Dunce Dull back of the class Champagne is expecting us to believe that Mr. Silvera shouldn't be seen as a murderer. Or no one should suspect Mr. Silvera because Mr. Silvera has retained the daft, ill-equipped Champagne to tell us that we shouldn't cast aspersions on Mr. Silvera. Mr. Silvera is a murderer. Mr. Silvera is a murderer based on the autopsy report. Or there is a ghost involved here. Whose ghost is it? I wonder if another Andre ghost let loose, but I'm not going to take the situation lightly. But if they're expecting us to believe that Mr. Silvera or one of the Silvera children is not the murderer, who then is? Was there a break-in and entry? Is the police investigating a break-in and entry? If they are, why isn't it public knowledge? It would show motive to the murder. If it's not Mr. Silvera, is it not? If there is a break-in and entry that you all are keeping private, would this not vindicate Mr. Silvera in public and stop us from calling Mr. Silvera's name? But if it is so, and Mr. Silvera has waited until he's outed by an autopsy, what is Mr. Silvera covering up? What is Mr. Silvera covering up? How much was the police, doctor, or undertaker paid to cover up the crime thus far? Who is and not is? Who are the first responders? Who pronounced her dead? What was your method? What was the clinical skill deployed? If it's a doctor. If it's the police, what training do you have in pronouncement of death? You know, this is so wrong, because how can a police, what if Mrs. Silvera was in a coma? How a police without clinical or medical skills or knowledge would be able to know that Mrs. Silvera is in a coma? You see, that's one of the wrong thing in our system, where a police is pronouncing someone dead. In a case like this, where we were told that she just died peacefully in her sleep. But what if Mrs. Silvera was in a coma? What if Mrs. Silvera was in a coma? What was the clinical or medical skill deployed to pronounce Mrs. Silvera dead? Mrs. Silvera was not shot on the street, Michelle. Miss Clark, Mrs. Silvera was not shot on the street. We were given a narrative that Mrs. Silvera died in her sleep. Now we know it is not so. Somebody murdered her. There isn't a break-in and entry. For me not to call Mr. Jolan Silvera a murderer, then he needs to provide evidence of who murdered his wife in his residence. He allowed a cover-up in public from the 11th of November until Friday that his wife died peacefully. That's the narrative. That's the narrative that Mr. Silvera allowed in public from the 11th of November until Friday. If Mr. Silvera is not the murderer, Mr. Silvera is covering up a crime. Who is Mr. Silvera covering a crime for? Who is Mr. Silvera covering a crime for? So I can call Mr. Silvera a murderer without the evidence, because if Mr. Silvera wants to go and sue me, so be it. But provide the evidence that there's a break-in and entry at your house. Come and explain to the public why you, Mr. Silvera, allow a narrative in public for 6 weeks that your wife died peacefully in her sleep. So please allow me to call Mr. Silvera a murderer. Mr. Silvera's wife wasn't shot on the street. Mr. Silvera's wife wasn't shot approaching her yard or whatever. Mr. Silvera's wife died in her sleep. That's the narrative from Mr. Silvera for 6 weeks. Mr. Silvera purported a narrative for 6 weeks. 6 weeks. His wife died in her sleep. No, it turned out not to be so. Even if she was shot in her sleep, she didn't die peacefully. Even if Mrs. Silvera was shot in her sleep, she didn't die peacefully. That's the narrative. we were given. Mr. Golden need to distance himself publicly from Mr. Silvera. All of us should keep our eye on Fitzbailey and the Jamaica Constabulary Force and the Jamaican justice system. This is one of their friends that is involved in a cruel crime. Don't let them sidetrack us with whatever they want to tell us. Don't let them come back to us and tell us that they couldn't find any evidence. Let us continue to remind them that they have given Mr. Silvera 6 weeks to destroy a lot of evidence from the bedroom. And while that was where Mrs. Silvera's body was taken from, I am going to assume Mrs. Silvera was shot in her bedroom. Why would you renovate the bedroom only? The bedroom nationwide report says, from the information they received, has gone under significant renovation. Who were the police that gave Mr. Silvera 6 weeks to destroy the evidence? Who were the police that helped to corrupt and pervert the course of justice? Who are the funeral directors who removed Mrs. Silvera's body from the crime scene? What did the first responder recognize? What did the undertaker who removed Mrs. Silvera's body from the crime scene, what did they recognize? You have to put the body in motion. For those of you who work in the care industry, just like you're turning sick people to change them, that's the motion funeral directors use when they go to remove a body from a private dwelling or whatever to take them to funeral direction. It's almost like a ritual. The gentleness in which you approach their body and handle them. What did the undertaker recognize? Did they spot anything? Is there an open inquest? We know Fitzbailey is saying there's an open homicide. Is there also an open inquest? There ought to be, because the post-mortem would have been a part of the open inquest to establish a cause of death. As the legal next of kin, Mr. Silvera would have been the one who signed the autopsy paper. The autopsy paper have to be signed by a next of kin. In this case, Mr. Silvera is the husband, is the legal next of kin. I just want to make a quick explanation here. I often see people get it wrong, or not wrong, confused. Next of kin have two different limbs to it. Say, for example, somebody is admitted in hospital, because this becomes contentious a lot of the time. If somebody is admitted in hospital, one can choose whoever they want their next of kin to be. That is called a medical next of kin. In the instant that person died, because a lot of time it happened, if the person is married and the person who is and it is not the partner, the spouse who is the medical next of kin, whoever is the medical next of kin on the hospital record, you become immediately irrelevant because you're now gone over into a legal territory. You've moved from a medical territory to a legal territory. So it now become a medical next of kin, which it first go by marriage or then by blood. So whoever you would have on your medical next of kin, if it's not your wife or husband, immediately after you die, that person becomes irrelevant. And then the wife or the husband becomes the legal next of kin. If it isn't a wife or a husband, it then goes to your children, or if you don't have children, it goes to your parents, and so on and so forth. But a lot of people always get that wrong, legal next of kin and medical next of kin. So while Mr. Silvera is her legal next of kin after death, he would have been the one who signed off on the autopsy. Did you not know that you were going to get caught out at this point? Or did you think that the technician who performed the autopsy was going to continue with the cover-up and probably say she died from a heart attack or her death is unexplained, because that is one of the fancy one when you all don't want to tell the truth. It's an unexplained death, or it's a death by misadventure, or whatever that is. It's never quite explained. But the country must continue to ask this question. The whole week may stop on this, you know. Mark Golden, hurry up and come out and distance yourself, because we are going to be on this, because we notice the media them now run this story. This is a story which should have blow up the Jamaica media wave. But mainstream media is rather reluctant, because since Friday this nationwide run this story, you search hard to find much on this story. This is a national story. This is a national headline. So I'm appealing to the blogging community. Keep this as a national headline. Let's do the media work. Keep this as a national headline. Don't let politicians and police, who we're expecting to fight crime in our country, get away with this glaring crime and cover up in public in front of us. We see they taking us out at twist and turn in the Donnelly. We see the great cover up in the Reverend Moore, which Reverend Fitz Bailey is telling us that there was never any foul play. But that Reverend Bailey is expecting us to believe Reverend Fitz Bailey, the Assistant Deputy Commissioner of Police, or however I said, expect us to believe that after Mr. Reverend Moore flew over the precipice and that didn't do the job, he turned around and hanged himself. Don't let these people continue to fool with. Don't make them always run with the narrative, say them are going to swallow that pill there. You're hearing one of the Nigel and Andre recording where Andre tell Nigel, well, we sell the story where the people them can accept it. Enough of the selling of story to keep with how them want with. This is a state crime. A crime covered up by politicians and police. A crime covered up by politicians and police. If Mr. Silvera wasn't investigated under the Child Endangerment Act then, will Fitz Bailey open an investigation, or the child, the policing department who deal with children in Jamaica? Will they open an investigation in the death of the 2-year-old Silvera in 2017? If not a murder probe, at least a probe under the Child Endangerment Act. Because now that we see Mr. Silvera's wife is murdered in his bedroom, and Mr. Silvera is covering up the murder of his wife, then the police should open an investigation into the death of the 2-year-old Silvera in 2000, the drowning of the 2-year-old Silvera in 2017. It is important to know if we're dealing with a serial killing politician. If Mr. Silvera can murder his wife in his bedroom, who else has Mr. Silvera murdered? Has Mr. Silvera ever murdered any of his political opponents? Is this the first the police is assisting Mr. Silvera in any cover-up? Has Mr. Silvera ever murdered anyone before? Has Mr. Silvera ever murdered any of his political opponents? Did Mr. Silvera hire anyone to come in his house and kill his wife? If that is so, could Mr. Silvera provide the evidence that someone broke into his house and killed his wife? Did Mr. Silvera turn up at home to find his wife dead? Would this be something that Mr. Silvera is expecting us to believe at a later date, that he came home to find his wife dead? If Mr. Silvera is relying on something like that, would he be able to furnish us the information that there was a break-in and entry? These are the questions that I have to ask. The more the questions come, I will be asking them, because I will be asking questions about Melissa Silvera and the 2-year-old Silvera. And we are waiting for an announcement from the police for the arrest of Mr. Silvera. Thank you all very much for being here. Thank you very much. I really appreciate your presence and your support today. Let's keep this argument alive. Don't give them time to bury any more evidence. They've buried enough evidence. Don't let them bury the entire case. All of us should be calling for the arrest and investigation of Jolan Silvera. And that's what Mark Golden should be asking for. Don't let this be another Patrick Bailey making us look like utter fools. But then again, the British teach them, because I don't know if some of you over here may remember that there was a British spy that was murdered in central London, that they said murdered himself. But he was found in a bath, wrapped and zipped in a body bag, but he murdered himself. Don't ask me how him do it. Don't ask me how he managed to do them something there to himself. These are the things that the politician them are going to want. Yes, in Pimlico, thank you. These are the things that them want if we believe. Don't let it drop. Don't let we shouldn't let this drop. The crime and the cover-up that happens here were done by the people who we are asking to fix our crime situation, politicians and the security services. Tell me if we're not mad. Tell me if we're not mad. It's time for us to wake up. Politicians are never going to stop taking liberty of us until we all wake up. It's time we wake up and let them know that Jamaica is not just for rich and famous, but for all of us who toil to make Jamaica work and to make it what it is. But what we want is a better Jamaica. If we don't stand up for a better Jamaica, it's not gonna happen. We are the ones who are going to have to fix our country. We are the ones who are going to have to fix our country. The longer we stay to come on board, the more our country will slip into chaos and anarchy. Good evening. Thank you. And we will see you later on tonight. We will be coming back on the Silvera issue. See you later. Thank you very much. And I really appreciate all of you for being here. Thank you and good evening.